Good afternoon. You're listening to KSVY 91.3 FM in Sonoma, and it's time for Strictly Business, the radio show that's all about business in Sonoma County, the things that affect it, and the people who make it happen. My name is Scott Hunter, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our host, Kip Altman. Kip?
Scott, thank you very much, and welcome everybody to KSVY 91.3 FM. We are, as I say every week, the only business radio talk program in the North Bay, and I believe San Francisco area, and the state of California, and maybe even the country besides CNBC and Bloomberg. We go into a little bit more depth with interesting individuals who are responsible for much of what happens in Sonoma County, Sonoma Valley. And today, we're going to be talking about a very interesting topic and a real challenging topic for those involved in it. We're talking about land conservation and environmental economics in Sonoma County. Coincidentally, I should say our guests today are Eamon, Executive Director of Sonoma Land Trust, and John McCaull, Director of Community Conservation, formerly Land Acquisition Director of Sonoma Land Trust. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Coincidentally, there is a new book published in the fall of 2023, which seems to hit home precisely on the work that Sonoma Land Trust is involved in. Sonoma Land Trust is a 1976 organization. It's been out there for 48 years. But the book is called Pricing the Priceless, A History of Environmental Economics, written by a professor of agricultural and resource economics at North Carolina State University, who is also the director of the Center for Environmental and Resource Economic Policy. And it's interesting because this book goes back to the 1960s, and as I say, Sonoma Land Trust was founded in 1976, so it kind of coincides with this author's comments, and this is the comments he made, which I really found fascinating. He said, even until the 1960s, most economists understood their field as being about material welfare. When economists were asked to think about the immaterial aspects of environmental values, like the value of enjoying a recreation trip, or the value of the existence of the scenic landscape, a lot of economists just said, it cannot be done, because we are a science about material values, and that's immaterial. That's outside the scope of economics. That, however, has changed over time, so this author claims. His book is a quote-unquote triangulation of the history of environmental movement, government planning, and modern economics, so-called first book-length study of the history of modern environmental economics and the unlikely role economists played in developing tools and instruments in the support of environmental preservation. And again, I raise that book because it's a history of environmental economics, but it pertains seemingly as economists entered the field of environmental work and environmental preservation. It seems to coincide with the founding of Sonoma Land Trust, which goes back to 1976. First, however, we're going to find out more about our gentleman. Eamon is, I call him a Boston Irishman, because I'm from Boston, but he told me that I'm a fake. He is from Dublin, Ireland. He's the real thing. He's an original guy from the old country. And Eamon, you started to work in San Francisco in 2000, is that correct, with the San Francisco Maritime National Park Association?
Yes, that's right.
How did you get there?
Well, my wonderful experience when I first came to this country, I was fortunate in that I did a road trip with my wife across country and driving a little yellow Ryder truck from national park to national park. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that experience was life transforming. I come from a very small country with almost no publicly owned land and very little biodiversity. And it was an incredible experience for me. And that led me, when I came to the West Coast, to the decision that no matter what it was I was going to do here, it was going to be something to do with that. And I was fortunate in that I was able to begin working for the National Park Service in a cooperating nonprofit in San Francisco Maritime National Historical Park in 2000. And then I spent 11 years managing one of the Nature Conservancy's flagship preserves on the island of Santa Cruz in the south coast, where I was part of a team working to conduct the fastest recovery of an endangered mammal in the history of the Endangered Species Act, the island fox. And I learned so much about ecology, conservation, and, to your point, a little bit about the economics of all of that and how it affects every part of our lives.
Well, I was going to say that it seems like much of your work before Sonoma Land Trust, 19 years worth, was marine-oriented.
Mm-hmm.
Again, the Maritime National Park Association and the Nature Conservancy, ultimately director of the California Islands Program.
That's correct.
And I wanted to ask you, I know you just said the Santa Cruz Island, but Islands Program, what does that encompass? What did it encompass?
It encompassed all 8 of the Channel Islands off the coast of California, in that we worked very closely with government and nonprofit partners across the island chain to preserve what is some of the most biologically diverse territory in the state of California. Something like about 5% or something of the biodiversity found in California is found on the Channel Islands. Plants and animals found nowhere else in the world. And it also encompassed the California, what's known as the California Floralistic Province, because, you know, the national boundaries are artificial. And really, we share so much of our biology with Mexico. And so we worked across borders and also to the islands that are off the coast of Mexico itself.
I would imagine the Irish government was not happy about the fact that Ireland have our own islands. What the heck are you doing in California? You should be at the Aran Islands. Well, why do we have to lose it over here?
Well, you know, it's funny you should say that. There's so many people I say, yeah, I worked on the Channel Islands down south in California, and they say, California has islands?
Well, you made a shift from sea to land about 4.5 years ago.
That's right.
How different is it in concept or execution?
You know, the wonderful thing about islands is that they are very self-contained places. But also, you know, islands are both utopias and they're also prisons in our collective and cultural imagination. So that isolation is both enriching in terms of seeing a very special place with its own self-contained ecosystem and culture within it, but it's also at the same time somewhat isolating and feeling disconnected from the much wider world. And the amazing transition for me was that I should admit that I'm a Bay Area person of over 30 years standing, that when I first came to California, I fell in love with Sonoma County, because where else, you know, it's kind of like got all the best of Ireland and all the best of California in one place. You've got incredible wine, you've got incredible dairy,
and
but
rain,
you've also
and rain today,
and rain, and spectacular biodiversity and spectacular scenery. So it to me, it's this incredible microcosm of what's so very special about Sonoma County. And I think from a conservation business point of view, Sonoma County is very much a bellwether, I think, for what's happening in the rest of the state. If we can't solve our conservation problems, whether, you know, the nexus between housing and agriculture and conservation and clean air and clean water, if we can't solve them here in Sonoma County, where will we solve them?
Well, your perspective on Sonoma County will certainly force me to look at it differently, especially considering an Irish perspective. I hadn't thought about that. But we're glad you see it as you do, and glad that you're here to do it. And John McCaull, I got the impression that you're an Easterner who could bear winter, because you spent some rough winters up in there in the Rochester, Buffalo, New York area, until clearly you were well educated because you saw the light and you came out to law school in California. And you've been an environmental lawyer in Sonoma since 1990, or you practiced from 23 years, I think it is, from 1990 to 2013 before you joined Sonoma Land Trust. Why Sonoma, and why that type of law practice?
Well, I did journey across the country similar to Eamon's migration. In the 80s, California was both encouraging people from out of state to come here for public school, and it was very affordable at that time. So rather than staying in the cold confines of upstate New York, I came out to UC Davis Law School. Quickly realized, that the practice of law in the law firm environment wasn't as interesting to me as the scene in Sacramento. If you can write the law, that seemed to be perhaps more important for the work we're doing than trying to sue over it or litigate or argue over it. So I started working in the early 90s. Excuse me. I'll keep going. Okay, sorry. For different conservation groups, the National Audubon Society. So got very involved in Sacramento politics, the piece of raising money for the work that we do. But I also always appreciated the craft of lawyering when it came to land conservation. So the work that I'm doing now, if you're working in politics, working in Sacramento, you never know when you've won. The arguments and the challenges go on, and when you think you've got it figured out, it all comes back around again. So doing the work we do, land protection, very tangible. Find a piece of property, protect it. There's a feeling of accomplishment there that has been very satisfying. So the legal piece plus the political fundraising piece has been my way to get here.
Well, I saw that you had, as clients, you had companies and government agencies and even land trusts, Big Sur Land Trust, for example, and another one. And I was curious how your services, legal services, differed in those amongst those kind of different clients, corporate companies, government agencies, and not-for-profit.
The nexus always was around whether some of the clients I had at that time were housing developers, but they needed to protect land as part of the development process, so whether it was agricultural land or open space. So I was helping more of the corporate sector on their environmental compliance work. And then the land trust piece is exactly what I'm doing now with Sonoma Land Trust, which is helping them identify and protect individual properties.
So in 2013, you essentially moved out of private practice and became associated with Sonoma Land Trust. Do you still incorporate your legal background into the nature of your work at SLT now? Yeah,
absolutely. We have wonderful lawyers and experts in different fields that we work with, but I'm able to take this work. It's real estate. It's real estate, it's transactional work, it's contracts. So very much so. And I got my start with the Land Trust right here in Sonoma Valley. I was originally hired as the Sonoma Valley program manager. So I moved to Sonoma in 2005 and raised my kids here, and the valley's where I fell in love with Sonoma County.
Well, understandable. So for a bit of perspective, Sonoma Land Trust was founded in 1976, 48 years ago. And here are a few statistics. The Land Trust, according to the Land Trust itself, has protected 58,347 acres across 91 protected lands. It's negotiated 47 conservation easements and created 19 preserves in Sonoma County. Now, I mentioned to Eamon and John earlier that I was a little bit confused by the percentage numbers. The 58,000 acres constitutes approximately 22% of Sonoma County lands, which have been conserved due to the work of land trusts, county, and other government agencies and conservation partners. And simple math got me to 22%. I mean, 58,000 acres is 22% of about 223,000 acres. And I said, really, is that all we're talking about? However, we're going to get into this, the state's 30-30 goal. And anyway, the number gets bigger, and I didn't understand how they all fit together. So we were talking about that before we started. And can you explain again what these numbers really mean? 58,000 acres protected thus far, but you have a goal of protecting quite a bit more.
Yeah, and I think it's important not to get too hung up on the numbers per se, because that's just the starting.
That's what my wife said, by the way.
Yes, indeed. It's important to consider that, that's just the starting point of the conversation. It helps people ground themselves in the scale of what we're talking about, but it doesn't really talk about the qualitative nature of the work we do. So essentially, in 1976 when we started, less than 5% of Sonoma County was under any kind of protected status. publicly owned or managed or under conservation easements. And over that time, thanks to the Land Trust and our many peers and the emergence of a government agency supported by taxpayers like the Ag and Open Space, we've managed to turn that number into 22% of the conserved land of Sonoma County. But what's important is to talk about the type of lands we conserve, the ways in which they're conserved, and more importantly, the value of those lands for all of the different constituencies and groups throughout Sonoma County, because there's agriculture, there's recreation, but there's also things like clean air and clean water, things that are becoming scarcer because of things like global climate disruption. And on top of that is something that we don't often talk about, but it's biodiversity loss. And it's more than just four-legged animals with brown eyes that we all coo over when we watch wildlife shows. It's about pollinators, and it's about the right mix of plants and trees and cover, vegetation cover that supports everything else. Whether it's the things that we grow for food, whether it's the ways in which the temperature in our landscapes are regulated, whether it's the ways in which we manage our water resources, and the way in which nature naturally regulates those elements so that we don't have to suffer the consequences of when they're dysregulated or they come out of balance, because we've done a lot of that, putting things out of balance. And that's why we have catastrophic fires. It's why we have flooding. And more than that, I think it's also the realization that, unless everybody's benefiting, then, nobody's really benefiting from the things that nature brings to us. So the 30 by 30 goal launched by the governor is an attempt to put some concrete numbers on continuing to protect and extending the amount of naturally functioning habitat and open space, not simply because it's the right thing to do, but because it benefits our economy, it benefits our communities, and it's deeply ingrained into the culture and the well-being of individuals.
We need to pause now for station identification. You're listening to Strictly Business. We'll be right back. And we're back. You're listening to Strictly Business with our host, Kip Altman, and today's guests, Eamon O'Byrne and John McCaull of the Sonoma Land Trust.
And Eamon and John, again, thank you for joining us today. And the work of the Land Trust is both unusual and heroic, one might say, in terms of natural preservation and climate neutralizing, if you will, of the negative effects we have in society today, climate-wise. We were just talking about the 30-30 goal, which is a California state-mandated goal. And what that means is, according to Governor Newsom's signing of legislation, I think it's legislation.
Correct.
The desire on the part of the state of California government is to have 30% of the land of the state of California be protected by the year 2030, thus 30-30, 30% in 2030. And that's no small task. That's about 6 million acres, I believe, is the number. And its relevance to Sonoma and Sonoma Land Trust is daunting, it seems to me, to say the least. Having protected 58,000 acres thus far over 48 years, you have major league aspirations to protect another 78,000 acres in 7 years. That is daunting.
20 Golden Gate Parks.
20 Golden Gate Parks. Well, the obvious question is, how in God's name are you going to do it? But perhaps more important, where in the county are the best prospects to do it? And by the way, we have a map here of Sonoma County, county is not small. It's roughly 65 miles, I believe it is, from Sonoma to to Cloverdale and Sea Ranch area. So it's a pretty big county, about 500,000 people, and about 7 anchor towns/cities. It's a big area, and we have a map which has we've made marks on it where the land trust has successfully acquired property already. But where are the best prospects?
I'm going to take that one. Thank you. So we're not in this alone. And getting back to the math for a second, the 20%, 22% of the county that's protected, that's our work and our partners. So that number you mentioned of an additional 78,000 acres, we're not taking that on by ourselves. We have the County of Sonoma through their Ag and Open Space District, the county park agencies, state parks. So there's a lot of partners. So if we were to break that number down, right now we have about 20. We have active projects, lands that we're looking at of around 20,000 acres. So our and those are real. Those are moving forward into actual contract or negotiation stage. The areas where
John, excuse me for interrupting.
Go ahead.
Are those private landowners or public agencies?
Private land. So Sonoma County, 1 million acres, there are vast majority of the county is privately owned. And that's everything from, small parcels, residential parcels to big land holdings from individual landowners. We have a lot of land still up on the North Coast that are owned by timber companies. So I think just geographically, the areas of greatest opportunity are the North Coast. If you think of west of Highway 101 all the way out to the coast, north of Santa Rosa and Healdsburg. That's a vast area with a lot of big properties that are still available and that we've had our sights on. And then down by the bay, down along Highway 37, the Sonoma Creek area, south of Shellville and the town of Sonoma, we have a goal of 20,000 acres in the Sonoma Creek and Petaluma River watersheds that we're looking at as well. So those are the two big geographic areas where there's large land holdings and where we're making a big commitment.
But two of your recent big successes are right close in, McCormick Ranch and of course SDC. And John, we moved up here in 2014, and I think I met you at one of the very first meetings up at SDC about what are we going to do here. So these things, perhaps you can talk about how long some of these things take, like SDC. I was just announced last week, I think.
10 years, right?
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. And McCormick Ranch, which seemed to be in conjunction with Napa Land Trust as
Correct.
well, right?
Correct. Yeah. And that's to Eamon's point earlier, we're looking at our work as the Sonoma Land Trust, but the county boundaries aren't necessarily always going to be definitive or determinative in what land we want to protect. So we have to partner across county boundaries. McCormick Ranch is a big addition to Sugarloaf and Hood Mountain. It straddles both county lines, and that was a 7-year effort. Sonoma Developmental Center is its own special category, but really exciting announcement.
It ain't done yet.
No, it's not done yet.
Not at all.
But people will start to see the parkland, all the open space land that's now being added to Jack London. During the course of this year, 2024, you'll start to see a much more active park-like environment and experience for people. So the short answer is most of the projects we work on take years of work, if not longer.
And just something to add to that is that, we're a science-driven organization. We have vast quantities of data prepared by both ourselves and from our partner organizations that help us zero in on landscapes that provide the most multi-benefit outcomes. So, for example, the McCormick Ranch that John just mentioned, that's a really important linking piece of landscape between two large open space entities, Hood Mountain Regional Park, Sugarloaf State Park, which sits on one of the most important wildlife linkages in the region, the Mayacamas, the Lake County, Mendocino, Mayacamas, sometimes known as the Blue Ridge Wildlife Corridor, which is super important for many different species to have the room to forage, to mate, and so forth. And so this is all done in a very, very scientifically driven and oriented way. And as for SDC, I think what's important to note too is that while we were instrumental in helping the passage of the open space to the state park system. There's still a lot of work to do there, and it's about the fact that it sits right in the middle of some of the pinchiest parts of the wildlife corridor that I just mentioned. And there's a lot of discussion to be had with developers, with planners, about the right way to do that development that protects that corridor.
And as Scott mentioned, it took 10 years to get that done. It is done, 650 acres.
Correct.
And in retrospect, what was the most complicated part of the 10 years to get that agreement?
Well, the first few years when I started in 2014, Sonoma Developmental Center was still being operated as a residential hospital. So that was 4 years of very difficult transition for the families and the residents there. So about half that time was honestly just closing the existing facility. And then the other part is that the state of California, that's owned by the state of California, the Department of General Services ultimately is the landlord out there. And they are a real estate-driven organization. They buy and sell state property for the state. And so we had to there were a lot of negotiations behind the scenes to get that land transferred to state parks. But the good news is it was cost-free. That land was just transferred from one state agency to another. Now it's part of Jack London, and we didn't have to actually pay for it.
And I should also make a pitch for another major transaction we accomplished with a state entity, and that was the purchase of the Highway 12 off-ramp right-of-way. If you all remember, where as you come up to Farmers Lane off Highway 12, it suddenly drives you onto Farmers Lane instead of going further, and the freeway itself seems just to stop dead. Well, that whole extension was an open, empty, 2.5 mile long empty field leading right into Spring Lake Park and Howarth Park, and ultimately into Trione-Annandale State Park. So it made perfect sense. We were contacted by a group of locals who wanted to see that land bought and turned into a greenway, a way to provide access to these wonderful jewels in our park system for one of the least park developed parts of the city of Santa Rosa. And and John, frankly, led that negotiation with Caltrans to transfer to the city of Santa Rosa. So it's not just about, the big blocks of wild land in the mountains and at the coast and in the forests. It's also about the land that we preserve where people live, so that they can derive the benefits of nature, recreation, and of course, in this era of climate change, reducing the heat island effect of those incredibly hot days we're seeing more of in our summers here in the cities.
So the land you just mentioned, I was trying to picture coming down Route 12 and Montgomery Village and the whole thing. It's actually coming from Santa Rosa, from Sebastopol direction on Route 12 and arriving at Farmers Lane. And it's across the road from there. Yeah,
you come off Highway 101 onto Highway 12 if you're heading for Farmers Lane. And it suddenly stops being a freeway and it becomes, a 3-lane street. And you can see as you're passing it where the highway was originally planned to cut right through Spring Lake Park and through Annandale Park. Oh boy. And folks and Caltrans decided not to pursue that decades ago, but the land has just been sitting there. So we thought, and the local advocacy group really contacted us and said, we live here and we want to do something about this.
Is that a Santa Rosa advocacy group?
Yeah, they're called the Santa Rosa Greenway Campaign. So locals, if you think of Yulupa, it just basically parallels Yulupa all the way up to Howarth, and it's maybe a couple hundred yards wide and 2.5 miles long, but it's going to create a whole new bike path and system through Santa Rosa that is a long time coming.
Is that why then John, your responsibilities were elevated? I think it's probably a fair perspective on it, to to Director of Community Conservation from Land Acquisition Director. Is that an example of what we're talking about?
It is. I'm still wearing the Land Acquisition Director title, but it's very important to note that, as Eamon said earlier, when we got our start in the 70s and the first even 15 years of our work, it was protecting agricultural lands, protecting open space and wild areas. It's just in the last 7 to 8 years that we've started working in the urban environment. SDC took us into that, but the Greenway is we're now working with City of Petaluma, some unincorporated areas to try to increase urban parks. We call it nature nearby. So it's to implement that strategy.
A little bit of skepticism, which disappoints me to even have the skepticism, but so much of your efforts are intended to neutralize the climate challenge we have, and to contribute to climate resilience through land conservation, restoration, and achieve climate resilience. Can you really do that? I mean, people are what they are. They drive what they drive. Hopefully, they're aware of the problem and think about how to reduce their carbon footprint, et cetera. But what is climate resilience, and how do you possibly achieve that? How do you know you've achieved it?
Well, I'll just throw a little statistic at you. In the 40 years or so that land trusts, modern land trusts like ours, like the Sonoma Land Trust, have been around, member organizations of the Land Trust Alliance, which is the governing umbrella group for land trusts across the United States, have in that 40 years protected 61 million acres of land across the continental United States and the islands and other areas. That's the equivalent of the National Park Service, the entire national park acreage. So when we talk about skepticism about getting big things done, I'm actually looking at that statistic and say that was a massive undertaking, and it's still going on. And it was done not by some huge, large entity such as the federal or state government. That was done by local individuals in neighborhoods in counties just like Sonoma County all over. But to talk about the specifics of climate resilience, there's two things we have to talk about here. One is the actual greenhouse gas emissions and, weaning ourselves off fossil fuels. That's a whole other separate body of work that the Land Trust doesn't do much of, if any. What we work on is what are the effects we're feeling today from climate change, and what can we do about them? And it turns out there's a lot, because if you look at the analysis that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has figured out, fully 1/3 of the source of carbon sequestration that's mapped out in the Paris Accords is one of the first things we have to do is to protect the remaining last acre of open, undeveloped land globally. And what that means, that's going to be responsible for 1/3 of the total of carbon sequestration to get us to that 1.5 degree target. But more importantly, for local communities, where it comes down to the local level, you know what the biggest killer of climate, you know the biggest thing that kills people from climate-related effects?
No.
It's heat. It's not tornadoes. It's not hurricanes. It's not even floods. It's heat. Heat kills more people as a climatological event than anything else. And you know what the best way to reduce heat in seriously challenged areas?
Forestation, presumably.
Pardon me?
Forestation.
Forestation, trees, parks. So we know how to do that. And this huge greenway that we're creating in Santa Rosa is just one example of creating climate resilience. But it's also about protecting watersheds, which actually represent the biggest water storage infrastructure we possess as a state.
At this point, we need to pause for station identification. We'll be right back. And we're back. You're listening to Strictly Business with our host, Kip Altman, and today's guests, Eamon O'Byrne and John McCaull of the Sonoma Land Trust.
And gentlemen, your comments are appreciated and extensive, because I have many more questions to ask, and I'm not going to get there because of our tyrannical boss called the clock. But I was fascinated I wanted to take you to the Jenner Highlands acquisition for a moment, because for its complexity, essentially. I mean, it struck me as kind of head-shaking in terms of how do you get this done. The Land Trust participated in or spearheaded the acquisition of Jenner Highlands, which
Headlands, Jenner Headlands.
Oh, I'm sorry, Headlands. I said Highlands, Headlands, which I've actually hiked, interestingly, in 2009. It's the largest land conservation project in Sonoma County history, with 5 years of fundraising required to make a $36 million purchase of 5,600 plus acres of coastal landscape. But the thing that, because there were 40 homes that were planned on that area apparently, anyway, $36 million required the help of 7 organizations: Land Trust, Ag and Open Space, Coastal Conservancy, Wildlife Conservation Board, NOAA, which I assume is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. God bless Gordon Moore for his founding Intel Corporation, because the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation participated.
Amen.
And the support, and Gordon, I know he's upstairs, but he still supports quite a bit of Land Trust efforts. And then finally, the support of generous donors. So 7 sources of funding to come up with $36 million to buy 5,600 acres, which took 5 years. And it struck me, now how do you, even if everyone is the most selfless individuals or organizations in the world, how do you equitably divide all that work? And who's responsible for what? And what do they want from the purchase? I mean, what does this Coastal Conservancy want from being part of this whole thing, or Ag and Open Space? I mean, what do they want in return for their funds?
That's a good question. In some ways, the Jenner project is, although, as you've mentioned, it was very complex, it was very expensive, it captures the spirit and working business relationships that we have for many of our projects. We do not sit on a large war chest of funding. There are some land trusts who we are particularly jealous of that have significant endowments and funds where they can step in and buy a piece of property just as you would in the private market. We tell every landowner that if we get into a contract with you, we're going to close it, we're going to raise the money, and we'll get it done. But it's going to take a lot longer than a private party sale. So that's the first. We have to work with landowners who even we go through all kinds of ups and downs, but they know that they have to stick with us through the process. So that's part one on the private side. With the funders and partners, I mean, honestly, we all want the same thing: the protection of the land, the stewardship and restoration of the land, and the ability, in many cases, for the public to get out and enjoy it. So we're tapping into grant programs that are well established. The State Coastal Conservancy you mentioned, California issues general obligation bonds. The voters approve those. They're sporadic. We get to vote on them every 6 to 8, 10 years. So we're tapping into state money dedicated for this purpose. So we've got to make the case. We've got to make the case of why a particular property is special, what are the attributes. But the Jenner Headlands, that wasn't hard to do. And as you said, you've been out there. So it isn't as if each funder has a what's in it for them kind of attitude. It's more about we've worked together for so long on so many projects that we got to pool money. Somebody's got to step up first. Who's going to be that first big funder? And once that starts to fall into place, and many times it is the Moore Foundation, we're able to, I hate to say it, but cobble together the rest of the money.
And I should add to that to say that, and this is where our individual supporters throughout Sonoma Valley and the county itself are so important, because it's their donations that allow us to do the prep work in terms of analysis, mapping, the legal issues, work through the title issues, and make the case to the major funders, because the major funders don't pay for any of that. We generally are the ones that are figuring out what should be teed up as the next target. The other thing I should say is that not all of our projects actually take that long. The big complicated ones, probably 5 years. But that would probably be true of a private land sale in some ways, because it's more than just the raising of the money. It's sometimes landowners themselves don't even know about some of the issues buried under the grass that they may not have been aware of. I mean, good Lord, the work we've been doing in the Baylands, there's railroad rights of way that have existed for 150 years that no one knew anything about, that, you know, we're busily working through with our landowners, who were as shocked as we were when these sorts of things pop up on the radar. And I should say that one of the things that John does a lot of is what we call technical assistance with smaller nonprofits, with local communities, and with landowners. You know, more than just us simply buying and transferring the land, but helping landowners to figure out what the right thing to do, or what's the thing they want to do with their land.
Ken, I got to throw in one more thing, because you brought this up in your initial comments about the book that you mentioned and environmental economics. We pay fair market value for land. So we appraise properties. You mentioned Jenner with X number of potential home sites. We are willing to pay what the market, there's a limit. We appraise it, and that's very rigorous. So we're not going to get into bidding wars, but we're working at what the market would demand. So.
Well, that was certainly going to be a question of mine, although from a tax perspective, in terms of real estate transactions, I mean, your Sonoma Land Trust has been successful in purchasing a number of ranches. I mean, as Scott mentioned, the McCormick Ranch and the Napa border, Fitzsimmons Ranch, the Fapiano Ranch, the Estero Ranch, and the pretty significantly large Gluckner-Turner Ranch, if I'm saying that correctly. To some extent, it's out of the goodness of their heart, but I would imagine it's some tax advantages to having sold.
Absolutely, and that was the origin story. Is that I believe it was 1975, Congress passed that they amended the charitable contribution law so that people could donate interest in land. So a conservation easement or a donation of land itself was now a tax advantage for that. That didn't exist until the 70s. That's when the land trust movement was formed in response to that.
And a conservation easement, do I understand it to be that when granted, the people don't have to leave their land when they sell it?
Correct.
It goes to you. It goes to SLT.
Think about it as a contract where the land stays in private ownership, and we're purchasing various future development rights, vineyards, housing. We buy off those rights, or they donate them, and then we make sure that agreement is enforced.
Let's turn for a moment to a bit of tension, if you will, possible tension. I'm not sure if it really is out there, but I imagine it could be, which is the conservation versus economic interests of Sonoma County. This is land and taxable land, property taxable land that the state will not get in the future. The state, if I were a state legislator, it's possible that I might say, good idea, but frankly, it's going to cost the state services we can deliver educationally, water, whatever it may be in the future, and our tax base is being shriveled. It's dwindling. Do you ever find those arguments coming to the fore?
Yeah, much less so now, and they're actually fairly obsolete tensions. We get them a whole lot less these days, and that's because as a society we've started to learn to value things like clean water and clean air, and also other industries like tourism. So there's a trade-off between what you extract and then what you preserve to maintain a certain quality in the surrounding landscape. So I think that we rarely get into those sorts of discussions because the state, as a provider of a lot of this funding, has figured out what it needs to support in terms of, as I say, those key, our marketing people hate us using this term, but ecosystem services, and so it's about what values you're looking and what costs you're looking to manage. There's a huge cost to erosion, to unmanaged forests, to not having the kinds of environment where people want to come and recreate. So those are all part of the discussion and figuring out where and how we do our work.
And speaking of costs, I was curious to know how large is your ecological portfolio, I think it's your ecological preserve portfolio. How large is that, and how expensive is it to maintain?
Oh boy. we have about 4,000 acres that we manage directly as preserves. And there's another 3,000 or 4,000 acres or more, or 7,000 acres that we monitor as part of our conservation easement program. It is incredibly expensive to manage land. And I think that's another one of the big sea changes that has occurred in the last 40 years, in that we used to have a very romantic, outdated understanding of nature and creating open parks and open space, that all we really needed to do was buy it, prevent development, and build a nice fence around it and a car park, and nature will just take its course. Well, that's not true. People have been living in Sonoma for millennia, and in the last 150 years, those numbers have jumped enormously, and we've changed the landscape. So, though that landscape needs help, and it needs management, and it needs the care and the stewardship of people to maintain its healthy stability. That is a concept that's really just starting to trickle down to many agencies and nonprofits in our world, although landowners have known this from the get-go. And so we're starting to see more money being put towards managing landscapes because of the tragic consequences of the recent wildfires. The realization you just can't leave forests to do their thing because we altered the balance of conditions that made those forests healthy.
And even relative to such environmental disasters like the wildfires we experienced in 2017, 19, and 20, has that made your life, SLT's life, a little bit easier, in the sense that maybe large ranch owners say, I'm scared now about losing this to environmental damage, and I should turn it over to people who will help us to in perpetuity? Is that?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's made our lives easier. In some ways, it's actually made it more challenging, because we get, especially after 2017, we were honestly flooded with phone calls from folks in the Miacamas who, how hard it was. They even going back to the property was hard for them. So the challenge is, as Eamon said earlier, we can't just respond to a property that burned and someone wants to sell it. What are the multiple benefits? What are the different attributes and location of that property that might have brought us there without the fires? The other part is we then would have to manage that property for fire. So we're doing a lot of work here in the Valley, cooperating with public agencies on fire prevention, vegetation management. So it is open doors that weren't open before, but it's also, we have to manage fire at a landscape level. So just how our properties fit into that is the big challenge.
Would you ideally like not to have an ecological preserve portfolio? Is the ideal to buy the land and transfer it to public ownership and be done with it?
Yes, and the ecological portfolio that we have is incredibly important to us because it is if you want, for want of a better word, it is the safety glass that we get to monitor the health and well-being of any given landscape. The fact that we're out there looking at changes in the landscape and checking it helps us to understand what's going on in the larger landscape. And it also brings us in close contact with our neighbors, so that we're not just this faceless group that has a name based in Santa Rosa. We're actually people that the neighbors see on a regular basis, and we talk to them about the challenges that they're having in managing their landscape. So it roots us in our community.
Eamon, I have a question about funding. I'm from Massachusetts, and I've spent many, many years on the island of Nantucket, which is all of 5 by 13 miles, 30 miles off the coast of Cape Cod. But in 1983, it started a land bank. 2% of the purchase of every home on that island paid by the buyer goes to a land bank, which then is used to buy the land and to preserve it. And prices have only gone up over 40 years, and therefore, all of a sudden, consequently, the land bank size of the bank, assets of the bank have arisen as well. could that be done in Sonoma County? A percentage fee charged to buyers of homes and land?
So it's in the terminology we've used, is a real estate transfer tax, essentially,
Right.
when the property changes hands. So got to mention and plug our sales tax funded county agency, the Sonoma Agricultural and Open Space Preservation District. That generates over $30 million a year. That's a lot of money. And that actually is, we have looked at these different taxing mechanisms over time. Sales tax revenue honestly doesn't create the political backlash that a property tax increase or transfer tax does, but it is something that has been on the table at the statewide level and here for quite a while. Luckily, we have resources right now to do a lot of our work.
Another question, indigenous population. Is that a challenge that you face in any real estate transaction? You have to, or do you on occasion find the need to meet with and satisfy the requirements of indigenous people?
I wouldn't call it an obstacle. It's actually been a huge advantage for us to be able to work closely with indigenous people and it's become one of our primary goals in land conservation is cultural preservation, respecting the rights of the original stewards and rights holders on this land. And that is a responsibility we take very seriously and one that helps us in our work.
Well, we applaud you for your work. Again, as I look at this map, it's not small, and it's the size of each town, I'm sure, grows and encroaches a little bit on your work. But most important, what you're doing is helping all of us, and I hope that climate resilience is absolutely what you're able to achieve and which we'll benefit from. So thank you both for joining us today. Really appreciate your time and all of your efforts, and we hope we can do it again. And I will go back to the Jenner Headlands and not call it the Highlands. But thanks so much for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Wonderful.
Thank you both. You've been listening to Strictly Business with our host, Kip Altman, and today's guests, Eamon O'Byrne and John McCaull of the Sonoma Land Trust. We'll be back again at 1 p.m. next Monday. But before we sign off, KSVY 91.3 is a community asset that operates in large part on donations. We broadcast over 450 square miles and reach potentially 200,000 listeners. If you would like to keep the programs coming, please go to ksvy.org and click on the Support KSVY link. And that does it for us today. So on behalf of our host, Kip Altman, this is Scott Hunter wishing you a happy and successful week ahead.